Okay, welcome back. We're in an obviously densely wooded area, and if Pat, you can pan slightly to your left, we'll be looking at the area of the lower slope of Culp's Hill. Bring it back around, and you can see a bit of the sky indicating the kind of depressed area between the lower slope, and then if you pan back over this way, the upper slope of Culp's Hill. So that's an important kind of topographical feature. Culp's Hill is not kind of one continuous landmass. Instead, it's segmented by these slopes. The area that I stand in is roughly where the 3rd North Carolina is going to make their assault. Now, as the assault kicks off on the evening of July the 2nd, it's going to go down the line Jones's brigade, then Williams' brigade, and finally Stewart's, almost on echelon because they can't quite mass everyone across the front that's necessary. As Stewart's men are coming across that field, across that area that we just spoke of a couple minutes ago, the brigade is going to become deranged. So the 3rd North Carolina and the 1st Maryland are going to kind of shoot off in one direction, and the Virginians are going to head off in the area of Wolf's Hill. Held in reserve, which is an important feature for what I'll speak of in a minute, is the 1st North Carolina. They're probably held in reserve on a small island in the midst of Rock Creek. So the area that we're at right now is going to come under heavy fire, primarily from New York soldiers, 137th New York, 149th New York, on the upper slope to the area just to our fore. Pappy Green's line has been depleted of men because of the actions that are unfolding farther down the Union line throughout the day of July the 2nd. So these North Carolinians and Marylanders and Virginians and Louisianians are going to be facing approximately 1,400 men. But Green has, to his profound advantage, defensive networks, entrenchments and networks of entrenchments that have been heavily created quite well over the evening of July the 1st and into July the 2nd. So this is a heavily fortified area. They moreover have the advantage of terrain, and again, this assault's going off quite late in the day. Now what we do know is that at some point, probably 8:30, perhaps towards 9 in the evening, John and Charlie Futch are probably somewhere in this area. Charlie Futch is lying prone, and as he's doing so, he's in the process of loading his rifle, and he's struck in the head with a minie ball. Now, the reason why these two men matter is because of the insights that they can give us into a demographic that we typically don't have a lot of information on. So my colleague and friend, Dr. Peter Carmichael, kind of first exposed me to the Futch brothers. They're from New Hanover County, North Carolina, the area around Wilmington. They're poor yeoman farmers, non-slave holders, and importantly, in the case of John, he is illiterate. So though we have this massive letter collection, 60 plus letters from John Futch, he never wrote a single one. Instead, he had his friends, he had perhaps officers, his comrades, his messmates, compose these letters for him. And what happens after Charlie Futch's wounding is quite remarkable. Charlie languishes throughout the 2nd and then is going to succumb to his wounds on July the 3rd. He's going to die. This is going to profoundly, profoundly shake John Futch. And after Charlie's death, he, or rather someone for him, will compose 6 letters, 6 death letters, each one talking about the death of Charlie in a different light, in a different way. And it's because they're by different hands that have different perceptions about what 19th century Americans called the good death. The first letter comes on July the 12th from Martinsburg, West Virginia. And in it, he tells his family, "My brother was mortally wounded and died the 3rd about 2 p.m. And this is kind of key to this letter. He was wounded in the head by a minie ball. He suffered greatly before dying, but since he is dead, I believe he is happy and no doubt far better off than any of us." This is a pretty traditional Victorian view of the world. Providence ultimately steers the kind of soldier's fate on the battlefield. This is, in a sense, almost all preordained. And John is trying to give comfort to his family by saying, essentially, Charlie is, in his words again, happy and no doubt far better off than any of us. Again, this is a very traditional view of how a 19th century American should die and the comfort that the family should take in the loss of a loved one. But what is unusual is as the letters continue to go home, the content therein begins to change. And two missives written in August, almost in both instances by probably someone who is semi-literate or transitionally literate, as Dr. Stephen Barry has coined the phrase, drawing from linguists, they start to characterize the death in a very different way. I'm going to read another section here. This one comes from late July, but is similar to one from early August. I don't want nothing to eat hardly, for I am almost sick all the time. And here's the key, and half crazy. I never wanted to come home so bad in my life, but it is so that I can't come home at this time. But if we came down south, I will try to come home anyhow. Half crazy. That's an extraordinarily unusual disclosure for a 19th century American, for a Southern man, a man who is guided by a fierce independence, a man who is guided by a kind of a strict public persona, self-determination. This is an extraordinarily unusual disclosure, and it gives voice to the agony that John has felt in the wake of his brother Charlie's death. Moreover, if you read between the lines of this letter, you can start getting some sense that John is increasingly unhappy with his time in the military. He's thinking increasingly, perhaps, about even something as radical as desertion. And in fact, as John's mental health continues to deteriorate, the letters become even more painful. I haven't seen no pleasure since Charlie got killed, he tells his wife, Martha. I am almost crazy. Again, that phrase, that word, crazy. John's mental health is deteriorating. He's becoming unmoored, ungrounded. He's having an extreme difficulty in processing these events. And again, what's so fascinating is the early letters by a different hand suggest ultimately the loved ones should take comfort almost be joyful in the death of a man who died, in their terms, doing his duty. But as the letters continue and as John suffers more and more, the content begins to change and we get a sense of a man who's suffering profoundly. And indeed, what is going to eventually happen in late August is he and a group of men are going to make a fateful decision. They are indeed going to decide to desert. And so to close off John Futch's story, what happens to John Futch is he and a party of men are going to be captured. And they eventually, in early September of 1863, are going to be executed. So when we come to spots like this on the Gettysburg battlefield, what I would kind of urge audiences to consider, what I would urge people to think about is, what are the long-term consequences of this fight? We can look at it through the lens of the environment. How did this hillside, which is photographed so extensively after the battle, what physical damage occurred to this area? How did Union soldiers and citizens deal with the dead on the battlefield? And the area, in fact, that we're around is an area that's marked on period maps as containing massive burial pits, huge pits dug in the earth where bodies are thrown until ultimately they're going to be removed in the post-Civil War era. But then also, more importantly, how does the battle stay with the participants? How was John Futch affected by the fighting that occurred here on the late evening of July the 2nd? And of course, what we see is a man who is profoundly unhinged by this battle, a man who ultimately decided that duty to home trumped duty to country, duty to nation, and he ultimately is going to be executed because of that decision. So our hope here is that we gave you a bit of an insight into a lesser known story associated with the battle, or the fighting rather, at Culp's Hill, expose you to an area that audiences seldom go to, and again, try to have you think more critically about kind of the longer term impact of this one evening that then kind of ripples across time. So we're going to continue streaming throughout the day, and I thank you for your time this morning.